Okay, in part one, we looked at the incompatibilist argument, and then we looked at a way you could respond to the argument. So recall the incompatibilists say that free will and indeterminism are incompatible. If one is true, the other's got to be false. That's a. But then we also looked at a way you could respond. Suppose you want to hold on to free will. Well, then you just deny determinism, and you'd be an indeterminist instead. And indeterminism actually has some scientific support from quantum mechanics. Well, today we're going to continue that discussion and look a little bit further into the indeterminist response to the incompatibilist argument. So, just for review, if indeterminism is true, then it seems as if there are cases in which we perform actions and we could have done otherwise. That is, it seems that if indeterminism is true, then having free will is possible. And it's because there's more than one possible future if indeterminism is true. But that's a problem. What? Yes, that's a problem. How could that be a problem? Well, let's take a look. The sense of could have done otherwise that arises when we consider indeterminism is not the sense we use when we speak of having free will. Let me elaborate. So if an action of ours is undetermined, then we could have done otherwise only in the sense that we might have done otherwise. For all we know, the action might not have taken place. That is, it either just so happens by chance that your arm rises, or it just so happens by chance that your arm does not rise. But this isn't the sense of could have done otherwise that we want, that free will demands, where it's meant that you have the ability or power to do otherwise, or that not doing otherwise is up to you. So indeterminism merely allows for other possible futures, but it doesn't mean you have control over which of those futures come to be. It doesn't entail that you have control over what future will be the actual one, okay? Instead, it just says some events will happen that didn't have to happen. It doesn't mean that you decided which event would happen that didn't have to happen. Important difference. So if an action of yours is undetermined, then there are no determining factors, and it's not under the complete control of anything or anyone. Instead, it's just spontaneous or random. That would suck. So consider your arm just going up in the air, and suppose that this is an undetermined event. But in that case, you're not going to be responsible for it any more than you would be if it was determined. And we'll find it, and instead you'd probably find it puzzling why your arm's in the air. Okay? So indeterminism doesn't mean that you have control over what happens. It just means that there's no one set future. But whatever it does obtain would just be chancy, like the roll of a dice. But we want free will that says that we have control over the future. We have choices, but we get to be the ones who decide what happens. We get to be the ones that choose what happens. So, it turns out, indeterminism also leaves us with no free will. Regardless of whether an event is determined or undetermined, we have no control over the event. That is, it is not in our power to do A or not A, since if A is determined to what happened by the past, in the laws of nature, then it must happen, and we cannot force the future to go otherwise. So if A is undetermined, then it is spontaneous or random, and so still not under our control. And that leads to a dilemma. Well, what's a dilemma? We looked at this argument. It's an argument form, and it's an argument form that we looked at in Unit 1. But since I'm sure you've no doubt forgotten that by now, we're going to review what it means. So a dilemma is a form of argument in which the arguer defends a conclusion by first presenting two alternatives that exhaust all the logical possibilities, and then claims that each alternative entails the same conclusion. Well, if the alternatives are exhaustive, the conclusion must follow. Well, what do I mean by exhaustive? What do I mean by logically exhaustive? Well, two or more options, I use in for a variable, two or more options are logically exhaustive when there are no further logically possible options. For example, either every event is determined, or not every event is determined. But there is no third option between those two. Those are logically exhaustive categories. Another example, everything that exists is either green or non-green. So, everything non-green is not green, and everything green is not non-green. Well, for example, numbers are non-green because they're not colored. So when I say everything, I mean everything. So here's the dilemma then. If either determinism is true or determinism is false. Premise 2. If determinism is true, then we have no free will. And we saw that argument for that. That's the incompatibilist argument. Premise 3. If determinism is false, and so indeterminism is true, then we have no free will. Again, just because there's more than one possible future, that doesn't mean we have control over it. It just means stuff happens to us. Conclusion. So we have no free will. That's the dilemma. That's pretty scary. Well, there's a response to it, fortunately. It's called the conditional analysis. And it comes from a view that we're going to call compatibilism. So recall in the last lecture we said compatibilism is a view that free will and determinism are compatible. We saw an argument against it, but maybe there's a way we can motivate either our understanding of determinism or our understanding of free will so that they are compatible. Well, we're going to do just that. So recall, compatibilism holds that free will is compatible with determinism. So, rather than respond to the incompatibilist argument by denying determinism, the compatibilist challenges the incompatibilist understanding of the phrase S could do otherwise than X. It's called the conditional analysis. The compatibilist offers a compatibilist understanding of S could do otherwise than A or X by offering an analysis of that phrase. Well, when we analyze a statement or an expression, what we do is we present another statement or expression that can be substituted for it without any loss of meaning. For example, being a bachelor could be substituted with being an unmarried adult human male, and you won't have any loss in meaning. So being an unmarried adult human male is an analysis of the word bachelor. It's a definition. And what you do in analysis is you employ more basic concepts to make clear what the original concept means. So unmarried adult human male, these are 4 different concepts, and they're more basic than bachelor. In fact, they're the concepts that make up bachelor. They're like, think of them as like conceptual atoms that form a molecule, okay? Just like H2O molecules are made out of hydrogen and oxygen, simpler entities in the universe. Well, concepts can be made out of simpler concepts as well. So concepts have kind of like a structure, much in the same way that physical things have a structure to them. So when you're doing conceptual analysis, then you're kind of like figuring out what's in that structure, okay? All right, well, when analysis is adequate, we can replace one expression with another without a change in truth. So, if you say Uncle Joe is a bachelor, you could instead say Uncle Joe is an unmarried adult human male, and that would not change the truth. Because if the former is true, then the latter has to be true also, because the latter is a conceptual analysis of the former. Well, the compatibilist is going to do the same thing with this expression. So here's the expression, agent S could have done otherwise than action A. And the compatibilist is going to offer a conditional or a conceptual analysis of that expression. And this is what they're going to replace it with. They're going to say, the compatibilist is going to argue that you can replace this with this following expression, which will also be its analysis. Agent S would have done otherwise than action A if S had wanted to. So when you say agent S would have done otherwise than A, what you mean is agent S would have done otherwise than action A if S had wanted to. Well, the conditional analysis makes explicit what we think is crucial to freedom. That one's free actions are determined by your wants and desires. What is it to be free? It's to be able to do what you want. If you want to do X and you do X, then you did X freely. Okay? If you want to do X but you can't do X, then you're not free to do X. Well, further, the compatibilist denies that free actions are undetermined. Free actions instead are determined, but they're determined in the right way. They're determined by the agent wanting or choosing or desiring to perform the action. Okay? And that's how free will is compatible with determinism. Free actions are determined by the agent's wants. So, You raised your arm freely when it rose because you wanted your arm up. So your arm was determined to rise, but the significant determining factor was your wanting to raise your arm. And this explains why we would be surprised if, having decided to raise our arm, it remained motionless. We suppose that when we are free, our decisions to act will necessarily issue in our acting. So then, recall, the incompatibilist argues that if determinism is true, then your raising of your hand could not have been otherwise than it was, and so it was not free. That is because, according to the incompatibilist, you can be no more responsible for your actions than you are for catching a cold. But the compatibilist has a response. In one important sense, the phrase couldn't do otherwise when applied to your raising your hand and your catching a cold is similar cases in the incompatibilist is incorrect. That is, given the past and the laws of nature, your catching the cold and your raising your hand were events that couldn't fail to happen. But there's another sense in which they're not at all similar. In another sense of couldn't do otherwise, however, the two cases are importantly different, and the incompatibilist is wrong. This is the sense in which couldn't do otherwise means would have done otherwise if you had wanted to. It's false to say that you could have done otherwise and catch a cold, in the sense that it's false to say that you would have refrained from catching the cold if you had wanted to refrain from catching the cold. We don't have free will necessarily with respect to that, at least not direct control over that. We have like indirect control, like we can avoid sick people, but you can't go into a room with a bunch of sick people sneezing and coughing on you and then just choose to not catch a cold. But it may very well be true that you could have done otherwise and raised your hand in the sense we're talking about, because it's true that you would have refrained from raising your hand if you wanted to refrain from raising it. So you're free to raise your hand even if you're not free to not catch a cold. So if you're wanting to raise your arm is not a determining factor of your arm's rising, then it's false to say that you would have done otherwise than raise it if you had wanted to. In that case, you would not be free, for you would want to do otherwise. Say, for example, leave your arm down, and yet your arm would rise. Your action, then, we say, would not be in accordance with your desires. Your action was not determined by your choice, but by something else. So you're free when your actions are determined by your wants, choices, or desires, and you're not free when your actions are determined by something external to you. That's okay? It's a pretty principled way to draw a distinction between free and unfree actions, and it's consistent with determinism. Pretty cool, huh? So, the compatibilist, then, has a reply to the incompatibilist argument. For review, this is the incompatibilist argument. Premise 1, determinism is true. That was the assumption. Premise 2, so every nature is determined by the past and the laws of nature. Premise 3, so S is doing X is determined by the past and the laws of nature. Premise 4, S could do otherwise than X only if S has control over the past or the laws of nature. Premise 5, S doesn't have control over either the past or the laws of nature. So, S could not do otherwise than X. So, S isn't free with respect to X. So how will the compatibilists respond? Well, they're going to respond in two ways. Given the conditional analysis, we can replace premise 4, S could do otherwise than X only if S has control over P or L, with instead 4 star. S would do otherwise than X if S wanted to, but only if S has control over the past or the laws of nature. And we can replace premise 6, which for review says, so S could not do otherwise than X, with 6 star. So, even if S wanted to do otherwise than X, S would not do otherwise. And the idea is that if the conditional analysis is correct, then 4 star just says what 4 says, and 6 star says what 6 says. So now we have a clear version of the argument for us. And now we're in a better position to assess it as well. Well, there's a problem then. The compatibilists will first argue that 4 star is just false. 4 star, recall, says S would do otherwise than X if S wanted to, but only if S has control over the past or the laws of nature. They're going to say that doesn't follow from that. According to this premise, your doing otherwise than you do requires that you have control of the past and the laws of nature. But why believe that? Even if you have no control over the past or the laws of nature, it can still be the case that if the past had been such that you wanted to do something other than X, you would have done it. You would have done other than X because freedom requires that our behavior be properly determined by our wants and desires. If you decide to do otherwise, you would have done otherwise. 6 is also false. Recall, 6 says, so even if S wanted to do otherwise than X, S would not do otherwise. Well, however, it simply isn't true that if you had wanted to do otherwise than X, you would not have done otherwise. Instead, when your desires are the proper determining factors of your behavior, if you wanted to do otherwise than X, you would have done otherwise. So, on the conditional analysis, the incompatibilist argument is not sound. It has 2 false premises, 4 and 6. But wait, there is a flaw. With the conditional analysis, here we go again. I'm sorry. What might it be? Well, I'm sure if you thought hard enough you could figure it out, but I'm going to tell you what it is anyways. So, and we'll tell it through a thought experiment. Suppose some evil Martians implanted a device in your brain that controlled what you want. So when they wanted you to want to eat pizza, they pressed a button that caused your brain to want pizza. Once you wanted to eat pizza, you ate the pizza. If the Martians wanted you to yodel, they pressed a different button. And once you wanted to yodel, you yodeled. With the switch installed in your brain, the Martians, they controlled your wants. Once you have a want, however, you would do what you want. So you had the power to do what you want, you just didn't have any power over your wants. You had no control over your wants. On the conditional analysis offered by the compatibilist, even the person with the Martian chip implanted in their brain is free. Because even that person does what they want. That's absurd, though. Does that make sense? Surely, if anyone is not free, it'd be a person with a Martian chip implanted in their brain, where the Martians could control their wants. Well, it gets worse. Recall the assumption that determinism is true, which compatibilists hold. Well, if determinism is true, then every event is determined to happen just as it does by the past and the laws of nature. And that's where a very big problem comes in. Not only is your sitting where you decide to sit determined in part by your wants or your decisions, your desiring and deciding and wanting is also determined by the past and the laws of nature. Given the past and the laws of nature, you could not have done otherwise and decided otherwise than you in fact did. Your acting as you wanted or choosing is free only if your wanting and choosing are under your control. But if determinism is true, then your wanting and choosing are not under your control. And that's consistent with the claim, if you had chosen to do X, you would have done X. So consider the case in which the Martians have implanted a remote control device in your brain that governs or fixes your wants again. Consider that case. When they set you to want pizza, you order pizza. When they want you to sit down, you sit down. In that case, you do what you want, but you aren't free over your wants. And that was an outlandish example to illustrate the point. But worse, on the conditional analysis, even comatose patients could be free. It's true to say of the comatose patient, if she wanted to get up and go see a movie, she would do it. But of course, and it just so happens that the comatose patient doesn't want to get up and go to a movie. For all we know, the comatose patient has no wants right now. But in that case, that's absurd. We wouldn't say that comatose patient is free just because that conditional is true. Of course the patient's not free to get up because her mental state's not under her control. Further, if determinism is true, then there are many influences on our decisions and desires that are outside of our control. Psychological history, our genetic structure, our socioeconomic background, and so on. So, well, in conclusion, the conditional analysis of S could do otherwise than X fails to capture what we have in mind when we say a person is free. So, the incompatibilist conclusion, if determinism is true, then we have no free will, stands. I'm sorry.